Okay, this is a third lecture for the day. This is a more general topic now, and a little bit of review of the book overall and the class. Um, Again, the themes for our class are growing up in the modern world and achieving enlightenment. And for both of those things, the notion is to think for yourself, to think for yourself, okay? And uh, in Candide, we saw that very clearly. He starts with a teacher, a dude named Pangloss, who's a fool, and but is built into Candide from a young age optimism. Everything's for the best, extreme optimism. Even when his face is falling off, or when they witness an earthquake and all this death and stuff, they think it's for the best. Okay, if you want a modern instance of that, it's you see it often in business and the relationship between salespeople and customers. That this constant positive talk that's often delusional. Okay, people telling you right now buy stocks and so on in the midst of this crisis, or short sell them, bet on the fact that they're going to lose money, are seeking to profit, seeking to turn something that's actually terrible for almost everyone into something that's good for them, and so on. Okay, so this exists, this optimism, and that's a starting point for the book that then finds an antithesis in pessimism that comes from this dude Martin. Candide finally witnesses slavery, this mutilated young man on the side of the road, abandoned by his family, mistreated by his quote-unquote employer, his owner. And Candide says, that's it, I'm done with pessimism. I'm done with optimism, I'm going to try something else. Meets Martin. Martin is right about things. Martin can predict how people are going to react. He's much smarter than Pangloss, but Martin's problem is that he's miserable. In his heart, in his head, he's thinks there's only either boredom or misery. There's no option for happiness. And Candide thinks for himself then. He finds in another person, but not really believing in the guy, just seeing it and putting it to use, this idea of cultivating your garden, being practical, being reasonable. Anyways, that opposition of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, of starting point, opposite, happy medium, okay? Pessimism, optimism, pessimism, and then a middle ground of realism, pragmatism, a happy medium. That's something we call that a classical ideal of finding a balance, a middle ground. Okay, and Jane Austen is a similar kind of author. She's similarly a classicist in that sense. Of her books have a starting point, an opposite, a conflict, and then a middle ground, a happy medium, a sense of balance and proportion. Okay, and we've seen this. I discussed this. This is a classical principle of balance and proportion, but it's also another way to think of classicism is that it sets a standard, a model that other people draw on. And we talked about two different models, but I've talked about two different models. One is classical Hollywood films from the 1930s and 1960s. In Hollywood, they all were rated G, our general audience, whatever the genre, thriller, horror, murder mystery, etc. They had to meet these general audience guidelines, and so that created a model. Okay, all the major genres are described in that time period too: horror, thriller, westerns, romantic comedies, film noir, police procedurals, all exist, and they've all sort of changed in ways since then because we introduced the rating system, and you didn't have to have this one standard of making films where like you couldn't have marital infidelity or it had to be punished. You had to show violence only in certain ways. You couldn't have too much blood and gore and all this sort of stuff on stage. And people pushed at the boundaries in interesting ways, but there was still this classical setting. The same thing goes in music. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, all these contemporaries roughly of Austen. Beethoven's the real contemporary. They set a model in music that similarly has this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, right? A melody that starts loud and then is soft, and that's the thesis, antithesis, loud, soft, loud, and then they come together and they agree, okay? And in Austen now, the two of these things go together. There's that sense of finding a happy medium. You start with politeness, being fake, being insincere. The opposite of that is love, is being real, love is rude, love is impolite, love is being yourself with people, okay? And it's beyond just like these superficial conversations that are politeness, okay? And then what's the happy medium, what's the middle ground? Haha, it's marriage. And Austen always leaves us there. She gets us through the starting point of insincerity, the sincerity of love, and then leaves us at this moment where the two are united again, where the couple is, they're friends and lovers now. And to some extent, marriage has that return to a little bit of politeness, a little bit of everyday distance from each other. Okay, the poet Marianne Moore, 20th century American poet, she described marriage as being alone together, kind of funny, ironic, contradictory thing. Anyways, the other way to think of Austen, so she has that classical search for balance, but she's also a model for what a romantic comedy should be like. It should take a single woman who's charming, but a little bit like down on her luck, like Lizzie, doesn't have a lot to recommend her except for her wits and her liveliness and her beauty, but not a bunch of money. She's not eligible in that sense. She has to pick more carefully than a rich girl would, a truly rich girl, not just this sort of daughter of a gentleman who doesn't have money. We start with her. And that's typical. All of Austen's heroines are sort of down on their luck a little bit. So they find a nice guy, and then they find happiness. And so it sets this model, and it's really true. Like, Austen is universally beloved. There's like tours of England you can go on, where you visit all the castles that are these sets in the different novels and so on. There's movies about her. One of the great ironies, there's countless movies and television shows based on her books, and she's so famous that they've made movies about her, and we don't know that much about her life, but one of the ironies of it is that she never married. And what else is she a model for? It's for what was it like, again, it's a classical period in our society. What's the classical period? The period of the beginning of the emergence of capitalism. And what were the people like who were the first kind of beneficiaries of the system, where you were living off the proceeds of investments and other people's work, essentially. Okay, so like the Bingleys, for example, are they don't work anymore, but as recently as their father, they made their money in manufacturing in the north of England, which is where early capitalism began. So you're seeing someone who's basically, you're seeing all these people who are there at the beginning of what we call classical capitalist period. All right, and so it's really a type of that. And it's not just me saying this. This is a standard argument, to the point where a recent economic historian in a famous book called Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty, you can look up this book, he refers to Austen to describe, in a book that's all numbers and everything, he just uses Austen to illustrate the economics of the system at the time, and how we've returned essentially to the system where inherited wealth is more key than what you do. Okay, and this is a big problem that you see political candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren describing all the time, and even Trump falsely kind of lying and faking his way alludes to these problems of extreme wealth inequality. But that's the time period we're dealing with in the book. And so again, she's classical in both these senses, seeking balance between a starting point, a disagreement, and then finding some resolution that's in between. So politeness that's fake, love that can appear rude, and then what's the synthesis of politeness and love? Marriage. Okay, and then also this model she's a model, the way classical works are models for what we expect in a romantic comedy that you see in Hollywood and stuff. And she's also a model of how does a woman of a certain social standing find her way in capitalist modernity. Okay, in capitalist modernity. She's classical in all those senses. And then one last thing to think about with capitalism and not with capital, with classicism, is what's another classical ideal? So we talked about balance, we talked about setting a model, and another classical ideal is unity. Okay, and you see this in the book. There's a lot of unities. Like the beginning of the book starts with a conversation between her parents. The end of the first volume, if you notice, returns to them arguing. And you see other unities like that where there's sort of like she does a lot with very little. The relationship between Darcy and Lizzie, it virtually the way they outwardly interact never changes. They're always weird to each other. They're never just polite. They're always it's unified. It's always one. It varies but that underlying theme that is always there, of their being not polite to each other when they first meet, and then throughout, even as they fall for each other, it becomes because of so many feelings. It's not polite anymore. So I want to play for you a bit of Beethoven that has this sense of unity to it, and also has those senses of opposites. This is Beethoven's Third Symphony, written in 1804. We'll just listen to the opening of it, and you'll hear Beethoven basically doing two contradictory starting points. So that thesis antithesis thing. The first idea is just two notes, really loud, da da, and then the second one, da 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 da, and then he brings those two things together so that the intensity of those first chords gets applied to that second melody, and you'll see them develop together. But it's really those two things just over and over again interacting and conversing and disagreeing at first and then beginning to agree. Okay, and it's that unity of, and really that da da you hear, it's the melody itself all stacked together linearly. It's a chord is basically a melody. What a melody does this way in time, a chord does all at once. Okay, so really that first chord is the whole piece, which is a famous theme. So I'm going to show you this video here, if I can find it. My slow-ass computer, and I only got 3 minutes left on my timing. This, my friends, is the Proms concerts the BBC puts on for free in London every summer. If you're ever in London, you can go. This is the East West Divan Orchestra, led by Daniel Barenboim. Very cool orchestra. It was started by Barenboim, who's right there, and who's from Israel, and then a Palestinian guy named Edward Said, who was a professor of British literature at Columbia University. And the orchestra is all young people it's both Arab and Israeli. So that was the first theme. Da, da. That's it. Those two notes, you'll hear them all the time throughout. And then now you'll hear this other theme, and they're contradictory. It's quiet. And you're hearing it echo all over the place, this theme. And you'll hear that that early theme again, those hits. They're interacting now. That quiet, lyrical, short theme and those hits that you heard at the beginning. And now the big theme with the characteristics, the dynamics, the loudness of the first hits. Again, if you're ever in London in the summer, these are free concerts. They're all summer long. It's one of the most successful music festivals in the world in terms of attendance, year after year. And you're constantly just hearing that lyrical quietness and then that loud, intense hits, like strikes. And again, this is Beethoven's Third Symphony, written in 1804, performed at the BBC Proms. The conductor is Daniel Barenboim. He's a noted Israeli musician. That's him. And he's leading this very cool youth orchestra called the East West Divan Orchestra that is made up of both Arab, Middle Eastern musicians and Israeli ones. So it's the living argument for how art can unite us and help us settle our differences that arise from politics. Okay, cool. These videos can only be 15 minutes, so they won't work out on YouTube. So I will see you guys on Wednesday.